Welcome, everyone. It is my great pleasure to introduce today Lara Sels, who is a guest professor in Greek Studies Department of KU Leuven and a board member for the series Greeka of the Corpus Christianorum, where she offers editorial support, meaning that if you plan to submit a volume for the Greek series of Corpus Christianorum, it will definitely pass through her hands. Trained both as a Slavist and as a classicist, she completed her PhD in East European languages and cultures at Ghent University in 2004, where she then taught Old Church Slavonic language and literature in their Slavistics department until 2012, when she moved in the Greek Studies department at Leuven. Lara Sels has published broadly on Slavonic translations from Greek patristic literature and the problems involved in producing critical editions of these texts, on which she also co-edited recently in the Orientalia Albaniensiana Lecta Ola series, an important volume editing medieval texts from a different angle, Slavonic and multilingual traditions, which is also the fellowship for Francis Thompson. She has contributed to the monumental comparative oriental manuscript studies and introduction, specifically to the daunting section on textual criticism and text editing. And in the past few years, she has also been focusing on the project of digitizing the vast collection of index cards of Francis Thompson on South and East Slavonic literature from the 9th century on through the 17th. And today, we get to hear about her work in the TeTra seminar. Lara, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dan, for this introduction, and thank you all for joining us here. Today I will present on, just on editing translations with the help of source text material, and indeed in my case that would be Slavonic translations from Greek. And I will use a brief homily on Pentecost, which I recently edited together with Richard Bishop as a case. So perhaps Dan, we can try to share my PowerPoint, which I will put on presenters mode. Now, wait, let me try to share this. I guess it's still not in presenters mode, so this should work. Okay, perfect. Well, every time I venture upon a new edition of an old Slavonic translation from Greek, there's two things that are going to be obvious for me. And the first is, of course, that we're going to take a look at the Greek tradition. This seems absolutely obvious, but it has not been obvious. It has not always been obvious in Paleoslavistic text editing. The other obvious thing is that my approach to the evidence, Greek and Slavonic, will be that of systematic textual criticism. Also something that is not self-evident in my field in the way that it may be to people working on, for instance, Greek traditions. I do believe that textual criticism with what is traditionally called the common error method has proven its value, its durability. It has absorbed some of the justified criticism of the past. It has its limitations, surely, but I think it's a pivotal tool for us to come to grips with complex textual traditions. But it keeps striking me how little has been published explicitly about the methodology of editing a translation with the aid of the source text material. Of course, also for a translation, the general rules apply, but I think there's some points that would deserve some more explicit attention. And one, and the most important point, I think, is the way the source text is used to assess variation in the translations. Why is it not addressed explicitly or rarely addressed explicitly? I think because people consider it self-evident and unproblematic. And in my experience, it is not. And so there's a lot of pitfalls. And this recent collaboration with Richard Bishop on this brief homily on Pentecost has been extremely instructive to me in that respect. So I'm going to use it as a case study today. I was asked by Richard to collaborate on the edition of In Sanctam Pentecosten. It is a brief sermon for the day of Pentecost, and in Greek, it's mostly transmitted under the name of John Chrysostom. It's basically a defense of the deity of the Holy Spirit, and there's only one Greek manuscript, the Vaticanus Graecus 1633, and its epigraph, that ascribed the text to Proclus. It has been published under Proclus' name by Vincenzo Riccardi, and you know, as it is with Proclus' homiletical corpus, that is far from being fixed, and many of the texts are still surrounded with authenticity questions, and there was also the case for this brief sermon that was still awaiting a critical edition, was awaiting an address of the question of authorship, and exactly that question and question on certain theological developments, ecclesiastical usage, were of interest to Richard. So the edition was basically meant to provide a solid basis for such arguments. It was the scantiness of this, of the Greek tradition of the homily that inspired my co-editor to take a look at the Slavonic. So in Greek, we have 8 witnesses. There's one, the O is a bit problematic, fragmentary. You have the earliest witnesses are 3 Vaticani that belong to the 9th and the 10th century. And as you can see, there's only this one branch with the ascription to Proclus. The text is much better attested in the Slavonic tradition. It's always ascribed to Proclus there. We have some 13 manuscripts. They date from the 13th up to the 17th century. So manuscript tradition sets in relatively late, but some of our witnesses are known to contain very archaic collections. That is the case for the Michanovic Homiliary, for the German Miscellany, and also this Athonite Hilandaricus 384 contains a very important collection. And our findings also pointed to the 10th century as the moment of translation. So our edition was made in classical text editor. It was conceived as a synoptic bilingual edition, basically a combination of 2 fully fledged critical editions, so one of the Greek, one of the Slavonic, and typically presented as 2 reconstructed archetypal texts with an apparatus variarum lectionum, obviously, and an apparatus fontium. Now, in handbooks and methodological surveys on textual criticism, translations are mostly mentioned as indirect witnesses to their original, and far less as the principal object of an edition, which of course to me a translation is. And on the other hand, source texts are rarely treated explicitly as a possible aid for the text critical for the ecdotic work on a translation. It's considered self-evident. And indeed, some things are obvious. Like clearly the Greek can help us to assess variance. It is a great help to root the stemma, and help that editors of original authorial text do not have. And I've listed some very, very simple, trivial examples from our text. So like here, if we have trivial variation in the Slavonic tradition, equally possible readings, then we may look at the Greek. So if some witnesses say, and Peter answered, and others say, and Peter answered to them, well, if the kenime to them is there in the Greek, we may suspect primacy. The other example is about the seraphim standing around him. One version does not have a verb, is elliptic but perfectly grammatical. The other has the verb. If the Greek has the verb, we accept that as a connection with the Greek tradition. I'm skipping the slide on problematic passages for now. Loanwords, of course, lexical variation. Very often you have, on the one hand, the Greek loanword, on the other, the mostly more common Slavonic counterparts. If we check the Greek and the loanwords actually agree very neatly with what we see there, we suspect this to be a sign of a clear connection between the Greek and Slavonic, and so of a pristine text, of originality. the Greek can also shed an interesting light on on anomalies in the Slavonic translation, because that is what sometimes happens with translations. You get text that is perhaps less idiomatic. You may get borrowings from grammatical structures from your source text. And without the Greek, these would just be trivial mistakes. But for instance, here we have a text on the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit has been mentioned before. Of course, in Greek, pneuma is neuter. You would have auto is neuter. In Slavonic, ducha is masculine. So you would expect another pronoun here. Now, the reading tožde, that's the neuter. That's the grammatically perfect counterpart of to. But the Slavonic requires a masculine. So it may just be that this is just a result of careless translation. Now, this last example, how as trivial as it may be in itself, it already presents us with a caveat when it comes to the notion of error. Now, the concept of error in textual criticism is, of course, based on the assumption of a flawless authorial text and an understanding of textual transmission as a process of a progressive, gradual corruption. An error indicates a move away then from pristine perfection. But actually, what matters in textual criticism is not so much the identification of errors, it is the discernment of the direction of textual transformation, of textual change. That transformation may be unintended corruption or may be intended textual improvement. And the case of slight attempts to improve a text, they're perhaps much less important for an original text, but they are very important for translations, actually, because, well, you will always see attempts to improve translations, either to smoothen out typical translation flaws, or by verifying the correspondence with the Greek, with the source text. So we should be aware of the fact that the original translation may already be felt to be erroneous. It may not correspond to our notions of grammatical correctness in Slavonic. There may be unidiomatic phrasing, there may be ungrammatical borrowings, especially in the first draft of a translation. Or it may not correspond to the original, to the Greek, in the way we would expect or in the way that we would find fit. There may be mistranslations, there may be omissions or additions. And editors sometimes have the same inclinations as scribes. They want to correct according to notions of grammatical correctness, and they want to correct on the basis of the source text. But obviously, this kind of corrections of translation, of issues in the original translation, would distort the picture of the original text, and also of linguistic usage that would be very important, especially for later translations for text from the later period, where the language is very different and there may be a lot of grammatical inconsistencies. Now, just let me take a sip. Now, apart from the errors in the translation, we also have to deal with the errors of the archetype. And then I'm using the word error already more in a text critical sense of a change that has occurred between the time of translation and the stage of the text that we can reconstruct on the basis of the manuscript evidence. Do we want to correct beyond the archetype? The source text allows us to do so. But of course, textual criticism has rejected the wild divinatio of the past. Many editors are cautious to move beyond the archetype. And well, indeed, the source text provides an outside view in connection, but the connection of the source text with the Slavonic is at the level of the original translation. And if there's a huge gap, in some traditions there is, between the original translation and the archetype, the editor will create a hybrid by attempting to approach the original to emendations of externo. And there's just, again, a very trivial, a tiny example from our text. The Greek says the advent of the Savior, soteros. the Slavonic says "Priscestia Sina," the advent of the sun. Of course, the Savior and the Son, it's not a huge problem, but we know that the standard translation of soter in Slavonic is sepas, and the abbreviation of sepas and sin is very, very similar. So we may reasonably accept that the original translation had not sin, but sepas. But to put it into the text would be to go back to another layer of textuality. So it may be better to put it in a footnote, perhaps. Now, the use of, it's clear already that the use of the Greek source text is not without its difficulties, even if there even were such a thing as the Greek source text. We all know there are further complications. The translation model is not some fixed and readily available text. The translator used a particular copy that may belong to any obscure sub-branch of the Greek tradition, and we need to trace and define that place that gave rise to the translation. So our text critical decision-making, our discernment of the direction of textual transformation, that relies on our editorial judgment, aided by that particular variant of the source text. And as soon as we're able to draw up a stemma, by the rule of that stemma. But the source text does not offer us a rule. Agreement with the source text does not always mean that it's not always a guarantee of primacy. Actually, even the term agreement may be problematic as it relates to notions of translation equivalence, as they may exist in different contexts. The source text is just an aid for our editorial judgment. And that means that the way in which it agrees with the translation copies already needs evaluation in itself. In our case, so for our brief text, the comparison with the source text gave rise to dilemmas and to seeming contradictions, especially in the higher ranges of the stemma, where the evidence becomes scant, and especially for the relation between the Mihanovic Homilia readings and the rest of the Slavonic tradition. So the evidence of the source text seemed to pull in two directions and often seemed to stand in tension with what the stemma was saying. So this kind of situation immediately evokes that huge stumbling block of contamination. So the influence of multiple copies in the genesis of a new one. And in the case of translation, the scribal use of multiple copies may include not only Slavonic, but also Greek source text copies. And in fact, most of the traditions I've worked on show traces of source text copy collation, in some cases to the extent of an intertwining of Greek and Slavonic traditions. And if that Greek re-enters the Slavonic tradition after the moment of translation, it may influence that tradition, and it may influence it possibly according to already shifted perceptions of translation equivalence. In medieval Slavonic literature, generally speaking, earlier translations tend to be less literal than later ones. And some schools, especially also the schools of Mount Athos, tended to greater literalism. The question then poses itself whether agreement with the source text is really the result of primacy, of originality, or it's rather the result of some source text supported revision. In any case, it's not an obvious thing, as may seem the case in my initial and very simple examples. Now let us take another look at these examples. Now, what we see here for Mihanovic, that is the upper line, is that it seems to connect to the Greek in important ways. We can see it in its use of loan words. We also had this ungrammatical thing there, even though it's of course in itself not that strong as an argument, but together with all the other things, you see Mihanovic, it shows traces of a direct contact with the Greek. But in other instances, we see the opposite. We see how Mihanovic is much less closely linked to the Greek. It is far, so the match is not as complete as we see it in other witnesses. So, of course, at some point, one asks oneself the question: could these kenimi, could they be additions of a reviser who compared a relatively free translation, existing translation, with the Greek and found something lacking? It could well be. It's very well possible. It's not so easy to prove. So for the Pseudo-Proclus text, I've been struggling with a way in which to connect the branches in the higher regions of the stemma and to qualify some of these readings, Mihanovic readings, where it agrees, but also where it disagrees with the Greek, as primary against the rest of the tradition. That would result in the stemma below here, in a two-branch stemma. To dismiss its peculiarities as secondary would assign equal weight to the three main branches. Now, the first option would make for a very problematic constitutio textus in many respects. The second option would give me, in a way, more solid ground, as I would be aided more by a three-branched stemma. It is my impression that a very careful approach to the evidence often results in more questions. So this is the stemma we eventually drew up. In a way, it is the safe option. But I do not want to linger too long with this stemma at the moment, because there's one more important thing I want to, an important point I want to make. And that is this: of course, in my work with Richard, the Slavonic was also meant to help with the Greek evidence. So also from that point of view, we wanted to find out where to fit in the Slavonic tradition on the Greek stemma. And at first it seemed really obvious. So the Slavonic agreed with this one manuscript, Greek manuscript V3, that ascribed the text to Proclus. There were other points of agreement. So we assumed that they went back to a common hyparchetype. It seems logical. But of course, then we realized that it's only shared errors. It's only shared readings that are demonstrably secondary that define filiation. If they're not demonstrably secondary, the agreement may just go back to the archetype. And from this point of view, the brief text on Pentecost was extremely challenging. So apart from the ascription to Proclus, the text share 4 trivial variants that have to do with word order, with the addition or omission of kai or hoti, and with the addition or omission of a quotation from Acts. It's a very interesting case. I spent many hours discussing this passage with Richard, and we have been undecided for a long time. We almost submitted picking the other option. So it's not really clear whether it is an addition. Was it there originally or was it not there? So we cannot go into that. Just to illustrate the methodological issue, it's enough to say that for all of these variants, you can make an argument for or against priority. So they're basically inconclusive. If we accept them as secondary innovations of the Slavonic and of this one Greek manuscript, then those two would constitute one of the 2 branches in the Greek stemma. If the arguments for priority would seem stronger, they would go back independently to the archetype against the rest of the tradition. And there's also a middle way, which we eventually choose. But these are the consequences of the choice that you make at this point. And of course, there's even an option that is very well thinkable, where the Slavonic goes back to a stage beyond the Greek archetype. Of course, this difference in the 2 lower stemmas is important from an historical point of view, for the facts of textual transmission, for the reconstruction of the text, the facts of textual transmission, but it does hardly make a difference for the constitutio textus, and it is not unproblematic to argue for the difference between a textual variant and a translation shift, a linguistic shift, that it's not unproblematic. So These differences in stemmas, also not the upper and the lower stemma, do not imply huge differences in the content of a brief homily, but the decisions we make do affect our reconstruction of the historical facts of transmission, our reconstruction of the process of translation. And in any case, the first scenario gives equal weight to the ascription to Proclus and to that to Chrysostom. The other, the ascription to Chrysostom is secondary to that of Proclus. Eventually, well, Richard argued against the authorship of either of them on other grounds, on doctrine and style and so on. So, and this is a stemma we decided to publish. We finally agreed on publishing this variant. So in many ways, we've taken the safe options for the Slavonic stemma as well as for the Greek. We have acknowledged the other possibilities in our footnotes, because basically there's 4 options, and it's just to give you an impression. If you read the frames from left to right, we have 4 explanation models for the historical processes of textual transmission. From right to left, we have 4 paths for our ecdotic practice for the constitutio textus, from the undifferentiated bulk of manuscripts to the scholarly reconstruction of the archetypal texts. I really believe that editors should deliver a stable text for the scholarly debate to evolve around, and that he or she has to do that to the best of his or her knowledge, to the best of his ability, and as far as the evidence allows. But we should not shy away from admitting that there's also a high degree of hypothesis in our model, and that there may be other options. I actually think that this hypothetical aspect of many critical editions precisely invites scholarly debate. So I believe an editor should try to do more than just document, but less than canonize. They should try to explain. A critical edition is an explanation model from where it's possible to try and understand the evidence of the extant texts as a living tradition. And, you know, if external evidence at some point will point it to another direction, or if other manuscripts are found, then the material will be gathered, the argument will be there to be challenged, and the conclusions to be refined, and most important, the text will be there to be debated. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lara, for this fascinating and illuminating presentation. It really gave us an overview of all the intricacies of this tradition. The floor is now open for discussion. If you have a question, you can either raise your electronic hand or wave or writing in the chat, and I'll give you the word. Maybe if they're not already, yeah, maybe I can start us out, because I was really fascinated by the sample that you gave us about authos and the masculine and the neutral pronoun, because at first it seems obvious to me, as you said at first, that the neutral one reflected the Greek. So, well, that should be the original translation, but then you pointed out that maybe it could be a retro correction. So how do we evaluate when something is the original translation, or when something has been recorrected afterward? I mean, this is really an issue to establish this kind of translations.
Yeah, well, it's one of the problems we're dealing with, but I think perhaps, I'm not sure if my example came across correctly, because I still feel strongly about the idea that the Mihanovic reading, erroneous reading, will probably be the primary one. The thing is that in other cases, Mihanovic has readings that I'm not sure are primary, but in this case, I think it is. And of course, you could say, yeah, it could easily be a trivial secondary mistake. It could be, but if you combine it with other, this is mostly what we try to do. We combine it with other examples and other evidence, which is harder for a brief text as this one. But to evaluate such a reading is always, this is, I guess, also something that I want to point out in my conclusion. We cannot deny that at some point we need to choose an explanation model, and that some other editor may well choose the other explanation model. This is what Richard and I were struggling with all the time. What do you think would be more likely? And then you can, in the end, you pick a version, you write the arguments out. But you know, yeah, well, there may be an argument for the other way. In this case, I really think it's yeah, this is a complicated discussion about the relation of the Mihanovic branch to the rest of the tradition. But I really think that perhaps many of these translations got revised early on, and perhaps revised with the Greek text next to it, and that grammatical mistakes and two things happened then, I think. First, the reviser may impose his perceptions of what the text should be on the existing translation. So some places, some moments, like Greek loanwords, others do not. They have a preference for typical Slavonic terms. So this might be changed, but they might also compare to the Greek source text and change a particular translation. But also things that seem not idiomatic, inconsistent with grammar, like in this case, they may be corrected. And I think that is what happened.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for well, the whole lecture. This was very, very interesting. I was curious, and I'm not sure if I understood entirely, so I'm asking a bit more detail about the situation where you have addition or omission of a quotation from Acts. I can imagine why people would put it in. Not so easily to imagine why they would cut it out when it's already there. Could you describe a bit what decision did you take eventually and how?
Yes, I'm very glad you asked me this question, because like I said, it was a discussion between me and Richard, and I had I also had the idea that when it was in, why leave it out? So I had the same opinion as the one that you're now describing. I think I am inclined to think that it was added, but on text internal grounds and about coherence of the text and the argument. Richard eventually decided that and of course he was still the editor of the Greek tradition, so some of the main decisions were ours, but finally his. He decided to argue for the version where it was there initially and it was left out later. That's another example of what I just said. Very often it's all about how you construct your argument, how you see coherence in all that material. And sometimes there are different ways to seek coherence or to find coherence there. And this was one of those cases. But I absolutely agree with you.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Aneta Dimitrova.
Thank you, Lara. It was very inspiring and very interesting because I encounter similar problems. And I wonder, how did you choose what Slavonic text to put as your base text? What did you choose? Because we know there are several editions based on singular manuscripts. So did you publish some of the edited texts, or you chose unpublished manuscript?
I did not choose a manuscript.
Okay, so that was the other thing
this is one of the points I was making at the beginning. I know it's a delicate issue in our field, and I know that many scholars are against archetypal reconstructions, but I believe in that kind of, I know perhaps it's because I'm in a Greek department for a long time. I do believe that we have to try and give our hypothesis of the earliest retrievable text. And I do not believe we're going to find it in one manuscript. Of course, there's always situations where it can be useful to publish a manuscript or different versions next to each other. But in this case, I'm sure it's an early translation. So we're talking 10th century. So we can use the Slavonic as a standard for orthography. This is, of course, one of the huge stumbling blocks in Paleoslavistic text editing. But in this case, as it's not a late translation, we can do that. I just proceeded as it is described in according to textual criticism. It's an archetypal text that is somehow orthographically standardized, of course, but it's exactly that hypothetical thing about, of course, a text critical edition, you try to do it as scholarly as possible, but in the end, you cannot deny that it remains a scholarly hypothesis. And instead of finding that a negative point, I welcome this, because I believe that scholarly debates has always evolved around hypotheses, about scholarly hypotheses. If you offer a critical text with an apparatus and with commentary and everything, you had all this way of studying all the different copies, of documenting them in the apparatus, of commenting upon the way on the way they relate to each other, and then you offer this text to the scholarly community as and I think that it, as I said, I think that it is more likely to trigger scholarly debate than to publish a text that we know existed like that we can copy, that we can photograph, and so on. So this is my opinion about that.
So it's a reconstruction based on the stemma that you create.
It's a reconstruction based on the stemma,
Okay.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
But I also acknowledge that there is this weak point that I also try to sketch here, and that is that you have quite different versions in Mihanovic, and perhaps I'll for a moment I can show you the stemma again. The Mihanovic branch is very isolated. There's just our famous homiliary and two much later manuscripts. All the rest, that's the rest of the tradition. You have an important Athonite branch that was the most productive, and that was certainly offering the majority text. But that Mihanovic homiliary is, of course, very interesting. We know it to be archaic. It seems inconsistent. It's less literal, connected to the Greek, yet on many points it's more connected to the Greek. Now, what is my theory about that? And of course, if you choose to do such a reconstruction, you have to choose. You have to choose at some point which readings to prefer. And when I said that you could have a two-branched stemma with one argument and a three-branched with the other, well, a three-branched stemma means that you're gonna take the agreement of two branches against one as the way to pick your readings. It is problematic, because if you chose the other option, you would have the Mihanovic in the scale, and on the other hand, the rest of the tradition, and you would have no way to pick variants. So one of the things I wanted to do at some point was to deliver the text that I presented it now, but with a special Mihanovic apparatus. Eventually, I did not do that because in the context, this is a very long article already. It's 70 pages. It's about Proclus authorship. It's mainly, of course, Richard's subject, and I do not want to burden it with my considerations on the complexities of the Slavonic tradition. But I hope to write something else about it, also about these methodological issues, and to point that out, that we clearly have two very early versions that disagree on some points, not to the point that it's really crucial, but it is crucial, of course, for the way it went historically. There's still a mist on these early stages of what happened when the translation was made. Was it revised early on? was another Greek copy involved and questions like that. Yeah. So that's the weak point, of course, of a reconstruction. But if you want, I'm happy to send it to you. Well, it has not been published. It will appear in a conference volume, and as you know, that may take a long time.
Love to have it.
So it's a very long article. But it's ready, and we're waiting for the reviews, comments. But if you want, I can send you an author version.
Thank you. Yeah, I would love to.
Yes.
Thank you very much. We have a question and a comment. The comment is in the chat from Catherine Papadopoulos, and she said that in some ways, copyist, translator, and editor all offer the hypothesis of a text. And don't know if Catherine wants to expand on that. If not, I'll...
No, it's just a comment.
Okay, then I'll give the floor to Christina.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this presentation. Did I understand you correctly that you said the earlier translations that we have are closer to the text, the more the literal translation, if I may use that word, and the later ones show more signs of being thought through? Did I understand that correctly?
Oh no, it's actually. I'm sorry that apparently some things were not very clear. No, the earliest translations that we have are less literal. They're less literal. Yes, they're less literal, and that is also why. So there is an increasing tendency to stick closely to the structure of the Greek. If we arrive at the 14th century, then some Slavonic translations are like travesties of Greek. Basically, you have like the grammar that is borrowed. In the early stages, it's much less literal, and gradually, and depending on schools and places, there may be a higher degree of literalness. And
yeah, okay. No, that's actually what I meant anyway. So the earlier ones are more idiosyncratic to the translational language. Yes, because I think that's interesting, because we see the same in the translations of the New Testament text from the Greek to the Latin. So the Old Latin, so the earlier ones are much better Latin, so idiosyncratic Latin, and then the later ones are more like a scholarly, have more Greek, actually look more like Greek. And so if this is a parallel, which I may just have expressed myself incorrectly. Sorry about that. So I am then wondering, can we say that this is maybe because the first initial translations were because people really needed them and were roughly, say this, and we actually used them, and later on it was more scholarly? Can we say something about the purpose then that changes, or would that be too far stretching?
Well, it is extremely interesting, and I really like the idea that we have a parallel here with the Latin, and of course the question why. But there's one more thing I would like to add before I go into that question, and that is that this is, of course, the risk that I was trying to show in my paper. This is, of course, the risk of using the Greek source text as a standard against which to assess the variation, because then you get a tendency to prioritize later, more literal approaches, and a risk of overwriting earlier, less literal ones. And I think that from a text critical point of view, it's a very important point to make. But to come back to your question on the reason of that, absolutely, in the beginning, I think they just needed the texts for it was for Christianization in the case of the Slavs, of course, and just for the building of the early Bulgarian church and so on. Later on, I think there's a lot of aspects that came into play. Greek as a language had more influence. That also had to do with, for instance, some bilingual monastic milieus. It also had to do with the idea that Slavonic would be, that it would lift up the Slavonic if it would resemble the Greek more. I also think in the case of Slavonic, and especially in the case of 14th century, especially Athenite translations, they're also almost theological considerations that play a role. But I do not want to go into that too much. I think, yes, there's something about the relation between the model, the exemplar, the prototype, and something similar that I think we, for instance, may see in icons that it's important to somehow catch some of the form of the exemplar of the model. But that would lead us too far. So thank you for your remark. It's really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have another question, if I may, that came up from the discussion. Do we have a similarity in what is transmitted with this text, both in Greek and in Slavonic? Like what is in the manuscript in the Slavonic and in the Greek manuscript? Do we have similar things in both tradition, or is completely different?
Would you mean what is in the manuscripts as a text collection of what? Do you mean
together?
The other?
Yeah. The other texts that are contained in the manuscript. Yeah.
Yes. That I believe is also a crucial question, because I think in the case of Proclus, not too much work has been done on his translations. It's interesting to note that if we see this 1 Vaticanus that describes the text to Proclus, I guess 7 of the somewhat 11 Proclan texts that are in the Greek manuscripts have been translated in Slavonic. And many of these texts we also find in some of the same manuscript witnesses. So it's important to take a look at, I think it's important to go and take a look at the collections, actually, what happens at the level of the text collections. So for the Slavonic tradition, we have some annual and semi-annual collections of sermons. So for the fixed cycle of the church year, but with additions for the movable cycle, for the time of Easter, you have a type of triodion panegyricon. So that's for the period stretching from Lent to Pentecost, and you have smaller collections. And at some point, I marked on my stemma the kind of collections we had, and that is very interesting. And I think would need to be the problems you have with the brief text, the lack of sufficient evidence, and so on. I think in a way to some extent we can cover that by looking in other texts from the same collections that were translated apparently around the same time, and to see how all the traditions relate, and to see it in a broader frame. But of course, one has to start somewhere. So, yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I have a question. I think it's piggybacking on Aneta's questions at the beginning, which is like a more general curiosity of mine about editing text in Slavonic, because ideally, if you go schematically with a critical edition and you have 10 witnesses from all areas of Slavic branches, right? And how do you go about it in terms of orthography? Which one do you pick? Do you try to locate the translation first and pick that, hypothesize on where it was done and in what period, and then you do that? Or how do you go? Because when they do editions, which if I understand correctly is the main thing, if you do an edition based on the one manuscript, it's easier, you don't have to decide that. But if I'm curious.
Yeah, that is one of the, I think, really the challenges of applying textual criticism in the way Grisses do it to Slavonic traditions. And I think it does not have to be problematic if you have an early translation, because, of course, you have all these different variants. But in any way, this Old Slavonic was somehow codified very late, and also within regions you have a lot of, even there you would find small differences in orthography. So it's basically either you publish the orthography of a particular manuscript, or you try to normalize. And to normalize, so we have the huge dictionary, the Slavnik of Prague, that gives us yeah, that is of course one of the products of the kind of philology that first established an Old Slavonic grammar, that first established an Old Slavonic lexicon, and there you have some kind of standard that you can use, and which is what I did for this edition. For the later periods, it becomes, and also in this, because it's also problematic from a practical point of view. So you have a standardized text, and then you have an apparatus. Well, I'm not going to standardize the individual readings of the manuscripts, and they're going to be in Serbian Slavonic, or in Bulgarian orthography, or in Russian orthography. You're going to respect the orthography, also because it may be significant for the variants, but not. I guess the text then is a way to remove the accidentals and to keep the essentials of the text. And of course, it is clear that that approach is that it's a textual approach, less than a linguistic approach, of course. Well, it is also linguistic, because textual criticism allows you to discern the linguistic layers and how also the language changed. And for that, to see the direction of those transformations, you also need to have an idea of the stemma and how the text evolved. But as a hypothetical construct, it's of course, yeah, it's you take the Old Slavonic scholarly standard of our tools or lexica or grammars. For the later periods, I also did this kind of reconstructive editions, but it's highly debated. It's not uncontested, I would say.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Sounds like a lovely mess in that area altogether. Very nice. Thank you.
Madalina, please.
Thank you very much, Lara. That was really very, very interesting. I would have a question about the question of authorship. So, but not necessarily the question of authorship, but the question of authorship in relation to what we see in the Slavonic. So you mentioned that there is one branch, I think, which preserves the attribution to Proclus, yeah? Or
That's
has
in
the attribution
that's in the
to
Greek
Proclus.
tradition. Yes, in the Greek tradition, you only have one manuscript that has the attribution.
So even this one branch means one manuscript.
Yeah, well, there's an epigraph. There's also an epigraph.
Okay.
So one Greek manuscript and the entire Slavonic tradition.
So my question was about the Slavonic tradition. So you have in the Slavonic tradition, so all of it preserves this attribution to Proclus. Very interesting. But then, and what do you make of it? How?
Yes. Well,
like textually, how do you? Because do you link then the Slavonic tradition to this branch, like textually, or not really?
Yeah, that is what that is what I was also trying to say. Perhaps I just rushed to it because
no
well,
worries.
The thing is that, of course, you have this Greek branch, and it has the attribution to Proclus in common with the whole Slavonic tradition. So you have the whole Greek tradition against this one manuscript and the Slavonic tradition. Now, if you want to look at it in a systematic way, so the way we eventually argued that was that you would have one branch in Greek with Slavonic, with the attribution to Chrysostomus, the other branch, the Slavonic, and this one manuscript with the attribution to Proclus, and they would both go back to the archetype where, you know, perhaps one of the attributes, well, we argued for that Proclus was in the archetype, but you know, this is, if the agreement of the Greek manuscript and the Slavonic is secondary, so if it's an error, so to speak, if it's a distortion of the original, then the Slavonic and this one Greek manuscript together form a sub-branch with an hyparchetype, and there you would have the attribution to Proclus. But if, on the other hand, the attribution and all the other shared variants in this one manuscript and in Slavonic are argued to be primary, which we eventually did not do, but I was inclined to do, then that would mean that both the Slavonic translation and this one Greek manuscript go back to the archetype independently. And the attribution to Proclus was earlier, more original than the attribution to Chrysostom. I think that also an explanation of an attribution to Proclus that changes into an attribution to Chrysostom is more likely than the other way around. I don't know if you have an attribution to Chrysostomus. I don't know how it, but of course, very often it says by the same, and as the texts travel together, Chrysostomus, Chrysostomian, and Proclus text. So it's yeah.
Thank you very much. Just to follow up on that, if I remember correctly, you said that eventually you decided against the attribution both to Proclus and Chrysostom. Do you suggest a different one, or you just not, or if that's something we have to wait to discover?
Not a real attribution, but so this part of the article is Richard Bishop's. So the argument on the doctrine and on the style of Proclus and Chrysostomus, he elaborated in the second part of our long article. But his argument was that the sermon rather seems to stem from the school of Severian of Gabala, not Severian of Gabala himself, but that it's that kind of homily. So that was the conclusion, but I'm not going to, so if you're interested in that, I can refer you to Richard or you should read his argument, but that was the outcome of the argument on the authorship.
Great, thank you very much. If we don't have further questions, yes, Amber has one, go ahead.
Sorry, hi. I do have another question concerning the mentioning of a second Greek exemplar in the Slavic textual transmission. I suppose that was concerning the 14th century further elaboration of the textual transmission, the Athenites reception, I presume. But I was also wondering how you're dealing with the possibility of a second Greek exemplar in terms of the edition. Is it mentioned somewhere, or how do you deal with this problem or challenge?
Yeah. Well, I would not so much say a second Greek exemplar. I think the translation was made from one particular Greek copy, but I do think that it's at later stages, and in this case, I know that the 14th century is very important in that respect in other traditions. For the Questiones at Antiochum, for instance, I think there has been important 14th century revisions. It happens a lot in that period. But for this text, so what happened, and that is also what you see in the stemma, that I have the impression that very early on there was a collation of an existing translation with a Greek copy. I wouldn't say another Greek exemplar, and the text is too brief and the evidence too unsubstantial to argue for the nature of that copy or anything. But I do think that at some point a more free original text was brought more in line in some aspects with the Greek, to a checking of perhaps, well, not the entire text, perhaps, or just where a reviser thought it necessary to fill in some gaps, or to move to a more literal approach. That happened. But I do nothing with that aspect in this. It's something I write in the comments, of course, but it's also in a footnote, because eventually it's very hard to substantiate such an argument. And in this article, what counted was that what is really relevant for our constitutio textus, and we chose a certain option, and we went by that. But yes, it's something. But this was one of the things that made me consider all these issues, all these methodological difficulties when you're using the Greek as some standard against which to assess your variance.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dan.
I very much appreciate from something stuck with me from your paper, the notion that the editor should do more than collating, but less than canonizing a text. I heard very early as a grad student the notion that somebody poked it into my head and it's been resonating since, that what we have in a critical apparatus, it's a claim, it's not data or proof, is just a claim. And I had the chance many times over since to just verify that, because yeah, when it's limited, you know, what we do can produce mistakes even in apparatuses. You mentioned that you might be following up the article that we've been talking about with another one on the theoretical side of the decision. I would definitely welcome that, and I think it should be very welcomed even beyond the Old Slavonic space, because as usual in this seminar, many of the problems translate in other spaces. What you described in this paper rings true in various other traditions for several of us in the room. So yeah, definitely follow it up if you can.
Yeah, well, it's half written, actually. I initially wanted to write it for a conference that I went to, but at that point we were still struggling so much with the tradition of Proclus that that the methodological thing just disappeared in the background. But now I think, yeah, it's definitely something I want to write. I put too much work in it already to just leave it there. So I think, yeah, you can expect that for the future.
Very nice. I look forward to it. Thank you.
I couldn't agree more with Dan. And Andy, you have a final remark?
Something maybe to follow up on what has been said already. I was just wondering also, because as Dan said, this relates to so many of our research, and also to mine very particularly as well, which I had a very particular case of working on Armenian version of the life of Paul of Thebes, and where you can very clearly see that at some point the scribe of the manuscript, and he explicitly says in colophons, he's taking a previous Armenian version and then comparing it to a Greek version and different manuscripts. So, and I was just wondering, and so this is very much a different version. So I was just wondering for yourself, at what point do you decide between one text being a living text or one text having several different versions? At what point does another text become a new version? And also to do with that, well, you talked about it a little bit, issue of revised translations, or are you having cases of double translations? Because, for example, in the case of this Life of Paul of Thebes that I mentioned, there's clear evidence that he was using for the comparison a second Greek version. It's not, so the original translation was made from one Greek version, and then his version is compared to another Greek text. So how does that somehow sound familiar to you in your case, or
it's extremely familiar? Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. So yeah. No. Sorry. Go on.
Sorry. We just finished the question, please. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
Oh no. Well. No, I forgot what I wanted to say. No. Go on. No, go on. I forgot what I wanted to say.
Well, in any case, it sounds very, very familiar. I think the question of different translations, different revised versions, redactions, and it's a very problematic thing. And as I feel it, I think that collation scribal collation with source text copies was more common than we often think, and that it's something that we should take into account. The question where you actually start saying this is another text, this is not just a variant of the text I'm editing, is I think from a very pragmatic point of view, that is the case when you feel that you need to make two editions, and that in some cases you cannot but arrive at the conclusion that you cannot condense that into one edition, that you have to do something synoptic or already with the Mihanovic homily, I feel this tension, but it's a brief text. It's not that many places, but it is another text version, and it is another early text version, of which I would not swear that it is not more original than the other one. So yes, and that's what I said. One of the ways I could deal with it would be to add a Mihanovic apparatus or something, which also things like that has happened for instance, the Dioptra edition, where you have an apparatus for a versio brevi, for instance, for a shorter version, or so yeah. But there's a fluidity. I don't think you can. It's clear cut, and especially also what you say about different Greek versions. In some traditions that are, large enough to distinguish between the Greek versions that are used, you can clearly see indeed that you have another Greek version that is entering and coming on top of what you already have. I worked on some question and answers, and there you clearly have an existing translation that was thoroughly revised in the 14th century on the basis of another Greek version. And that is something you have to edit separately. You have to publish it separately. You cannot, and I know that it has been edited as one tradition. And I thought in that case that was highly problematic.
All right, can I just add something? I just realized what I wanted to ask, what my additional question was. I assume you have, because you haven't mentioned it in this case, there's no comments by any translator or scribe or whatsoever about revised translations or translation method, that kind of thing. Does that ever occur in the Slavonic tradition, that you have this evidence of someone saying, I was doing this I've been using this multiple manuscripts and comparing it to Greek, or is that just it's only ever done on the basis of text?
No, that I came across that once, that there was a note in the margins saying that it was compared to another version, but then still you have to figure out what version means, of course. But it's rare, but it happens.
So comments are rare, but in terms of when you investigate a text, it's quite common probably, or is it also quite rare?
No, I think it's very common. It's my impression that it happened all the time, but perhaps it's just the traditions I have been working on, but it's my impression that it happened very, very often, that a Greek was brought in at some point. And it's something that is not taken into account enough, for instance, when you use a source text to help you decide on original primary readings. And that often distorts, I think, our view of textual transmission.
For sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And I would like to thank once again Lara Sels for this fascinating presentation, and thank everybody who joined, and see you next time.
Okay, thank you. See you next
Bye.
time. Bye-bye.